Welcome back, everyone. 25% tariffs on all imported vehicles and auto parts has hit the automotive industry hard. And that's why over the course of the next few videos, I'm going to walk you through the entire automotive supply chain. We'll start off in part 1 of the series covering the tier 3, 2, and 1 suppliers that provide the building blocks necessary to build the cars themselves. And we're going to try to identify the key players who stand to win and those that are likely to lose from these tariffs, while keeping a long-term investing horizon, because it's not just about the short-term noise, it's about identifying secular growth trends and competitively advantaged businesses, and ultimately businesses that are mispriced relative to their future returns. But before we dive in, I think it's important for us to take a step back and look at the ripple effects of these proposed tariffs. Now, as of the time I'm recording this video, the exact severity of these tariffs remains uncertain, but what's more clear is the direction of the policy. The US has been pushing for reshoring jobs and reducing reliance on other nations and increasing domestic manufacturing. Now, we could argue whether or not any of these things are actually going to work, but I think what's more important is trying to understand how sticky these tariffs are going to be. And I'm starting to believe Mr. Donald Trump is not bluffing. Take a look at this clip from an interview with Oprah all the way back in 1998.
What would you do differently, Donald?
I'd make our allies, forgetting about the enemies you can't talk to so easily, I'd make our allies pay their fair share. We're a debtor nation. Something's going to happen over the next number of years with this country, because you can't keep going on losing $200 billion, and yet we let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible. They don't have laws against it. They just make it impossible. They come over here, they sell their cars, their VCRs, they knock the hell out of our companies. And hey, I have tremendous respect for the Japanese people. I mean, you can respect somebody that's beating the hell out of you, but they are beating the hell out of this country. Kuwait, they live like kings. The poorest person in Kuwait, they live like kings. And yet they're not paying. We make it possible for them to sell their oil. Why aren't they paying us 25% of what they're making? It's a joke.
So yes, he is serious. He has been saying the same thing over and over again for a very long time. Also, a second order effect of reshoring and manufacturing that doesn't seem to get much attention is that Donald Trump eventually wants to transform the US from a net importer to net exporter, reversing decades of offshoring to low-cost labor markets like China, Vietnam, and others. But to become a net exporter, you usually need a weaker dollar that makes your goods more competitive globally. Here's the problem. The US dollar isn't just any currency, it's the global reserve currency. That means other countries hold dollar-denominated assets like treasuries for a few key reasons. They use it to settle international trade for commodities like oil, grain, and metals, and they also hold it as a liquidity reserve and a safe haven for their assets. You cannot be the global reserve currency and at the same time be the low-cost exporting powerhouse. They just don't marry. One requires a stable, strong currency, and the other requires a weaker dollar. These are not new insights. It was pointed out as far back as 1959 by Robert Tryphon, and he predicted the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which did eventually collapse in 1971. So why is this important? Well, our goal is to identify winners, companies with sustainable competitive advantages. That's where our focus should be. But even the strongest moats can get disrupted by forces outside of their control, like regulatory shifts, changes in macroeconomic policies, or tariffs, for example. I think it's helpful for us to keep 10% of our attention on these broader dynamics, like if interest rates remain higher for longer, or if there was a weakening dollar, how might that affect our portfolios? Think of it as a set of guardrails that help you see the forest from the trees without looking like you have your head in the sand. So let's dive into the start of the automotive supply chain, and these are commonly referred to as tier 3 suppliers. These make up the initial building blocks of the automotive industry. Additionally, I think it's helpful to split these into materials used for electric vehicles, or EVs, and traditional internal combustion engines, or ICE vehicles. And there are several materials that are common across both types. When it comes to EVs, the most commonly discussed materials revolve around batteries, which is the biggest area of innovation at the moment. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, silicon, and graphite are the most common materials associated with electric vehicle batteries. Once extracted, these materials still need to be refined, a process handled by midstream companies before they're ready to be used in battery cells. After refining, the processed materials can be used in cell manufacturing, and there are various different innovations regarding the battery cell design and pack that can occur at this stage. At the most basic level, a battery, as we know it, starts off with a battery cell. That consists of the anode, which is usually graphite, the cathode, which can be made up of a mix of different materials like lithium, nickel, cobalt, or what is more commonly found in Chinese batteries, iron or phosphorus. All the various compositions of batteries still require lithium to carry charge across from the cathode to the anode and then back again. Now, the cathode is probably the most interesting part of the battery cell because it accounts for a major portion of the cost of the battery itself. Around 50% of the cost comes from the cathode due to the different compositions of materials used in it. And depending on the chemistry of the battery, this influences its energy density, or kilogram per kilowatt hour, or as you'd like to think about it, more dense batteries equals more range. And therefore, if you have more range, you can opt for maybe smaller or lighter batteries. And demand for these elements is still rising, with an estimated 8% of the global demand for lithium coming from EVs alone, with cobalt, graphite, and nickel just behind. So where are these materials coming from and who's producing them? Around 65 to 80% of the world's lithium comes from Chile and Australia, with Albemarle the major producer. This is usually mined from salt flat brines, and this method accounts for about 80% of all lithium production currently. Albemarle is the world's largest lithium producer. While their mines are not US-based, it is a US domiciled company, and as such may offer some insulation from the worst effects of the future tariffs. Lithium accounts for 75% of the total revenue, with the remaining parts being bromine specialties, which are products used for flame retardants, oil and gas drilling fluids, and pharmaceuticals. Given the demand for lithium, you might have expected the price of lithium to be through the roof, and Albemarle to be a huge beneficiary of this. But as is the case in most industries, lithium is following a classic industry cost curve. What happened was, after skyrocketing demand, more miners have come online in response, as they've poured billions into new mines and expansions. The result was a lot of new lithium supply hitting the market and driving prices down. And additionally, the new LFP batteries from China require less expensive lithium per battery and are growing fast. As for cobalt, 70% of the global production comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC. Glencore is the largest cobalt producer worldwide, followed by China molybdenum. Interestingly, Glencore is rather quiet about their cobalt productions when you look at their maps, as they primarily consider cobalt a byproduct of their copper mining, which might be fair as it only generates 5 to 7% of their total revenue. Their top money makers are actually copper, coal, followed by nickel. If you were to consider Glencore an investment, it would be worth noting that they actually only generate 50% of their revenue from mining efforts, and the rest is coming from trading commodities like oil, metals, and coal. Another company that is not a true automotive play, but more a tariff play, is MP Materials. It owns the only rare earth mine in the US in Mountain Pass, California. With the passing of the CHIPS Act, Donald Trump is attempting to reshore what he considers critical minerals and rare earths. They currently produce neodymium-based products, which are among the strongest permanent magnets known, and other rare earth concentrates. These are also integral components for speakers, microphones, and wireless charging. Its stock has surged recently, probably due to speculation that it'll be a major beneficiary of these tariff policies. However, the big problem is it doesn't actually refine any of the materials it mines itself. It actually sends most of that to China, and that's a big problem. And actually, they've recently released news to suggest that they've halted their shipments to China for refinement. That may be because they're able to now bring more refinement online in the US. However, these are question marks that still need answering. Another material that's worth bringing into the conversation is copper, and not just because of its demand in EV vehicles, but because of the overall global demand for copper in general. Freeport-McMoRan is the largest US copper producer, with about 80% of its revenue coming from copper and the rest a mix of gold, molybdenum, and others. It has mining operations in Indonesia, the US, and South America mainly. It's been estimated that battery electric vehicles require about 5 times more copper than that of the traditional ICE vehicle. However, there is some evidence to suggest that the amount of copper content in vehicles has begun to wane, with alternative materials being sourced for copper wiring harnesses. Basically, these harnesses help to deliver power and connect various components of the car. As for other raw materials, you might consider Vale, a South American giant that is a major player in the iron mining business. Iron is also a raw input for steel, and Vale is heavily reliant on Chinese demand. If demand for iron or steel goes down in China, they might face some potential headwinds. And it's also not outside the realms of possibilities that they might face some potential fines or penalties for trading with Chinese companies. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the raw materials in EVs, and for good reason, because it's the fastest growing type of vehicle by method of propulsion. However, for completeness, I'd like to cover the materials used also in ICE vehicles. It's not as exciting, but you'll mainly find the composition to be of steel, aluminum, with a small segment for platinum and palladium that is used in catalytic converters. This helps turn harmful toxins produced by the engines into less harmful ones, like turning carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide. Coming back to aluminum, this is becoming increasingly more common in vehicle construction. We are seeing it replace heavier cast iron engines, especially in EVs, as it's twice as light as iron. However, the trade-off is that aluminum is not as strong as cast iron, therefore you need larger engine blocks. Additionally, aluminum is being used more commonly than steel for EV car bodies due to its lighter weight, despite steel being actually the cheaper material. And there has been an increasing trend, especially in China, towards megacasting, which is 3D printed body components, the printing of entire car bodies as opposed to assembling parts, which would likely lead to lower manufacturing costs in the long run. The top U.S. producer of aluminum is Alcoa Corporation, with production of around 2 million tons annually. But just to put this into context, China's Hongqi is the largest producer with around 6.5 million tons. As a secondary goal of this video is obviously to highlight companies that are advantaged from these tariffs, I'll focus on Alcoa a little bit more. What differentiates them is the fact that they're completely vertically integrated. That means from the mining to the refining to the smelting, all happens under one roof. The company operates in 10 countries, including significant assets in Australia, Brazil, Canada, and Spain. And turning our attention to steel, this is being used for car bodies, suspensions, and chassis mainly. We've briefly discussed that iron ore is a core input into the making of steel. There are generally two major methods of making steel. One is using a blast furnace, which uses iron ore and coke. This produces molten iron, which is then refined into steel. The second is using an electric air furnace, or EAF, which primarily uses scrap metal as an input. EAFs have the advantage of being able to ramp up and ramp down more easily, making them more flexible and often more profitable in the variable market conditions. As for the companies operating in this space, we'll focus mainly on the US ones since there are a number of them. US Steel has around $18 billion in revenue and operates a traditional blast furnace. It's less modernized than its peers, but has been shifting slowly towards EAF mini mills. And then we have Cleveland-Cliffs, which was founded in 1847, and with revenue of about $21 billion, is fairly vertically integrated. It mines its own iron ore and produces finished steel products with a heavy focus on the automotive grade steel. Nucor, which is a major player in the steel industry, was founded in 1940, and it is the largest mini-mill steel producer with revenue of around $35 billion and is considered one of the best-in-class operators. And then we have Steel Dynamics, which was founded by Nucor alumni in 1993 and has a revenue of around 18 to 19 billion and mainly operates EAF-based mini-mills using scrap metal and has a strong reputation for capital allocation and efficiency. And here's a brief comparison of some of the financial numbers. Alright, so thank you for sticking around this long. I hope this has been helpful. We're moving on now to Tier 2 suppliers. So Tier 2 suppliers are generally one level up or down the supply chain depending on how you look at it. And this is the area where the actual boundaries is the most foggy because depending on how you look at it, they could be potentially seen as Tier 1 or Tier 3. So these lines should never be seen as absolute. They supply products like wiring harnesses, glazing, adhesives, and other essential components that act as enablers for vehicle production. I have included them in this table for completeness, so you can pause here and take a closer look if you'd like. However, arguably the most exciting area of the Tier 2 supply chain is the automotive semiconductor chips, which are helping build the software-defined vehicles of the future. When it comes to automotive semiconductor chips, there are a lot of companies involved. However, I'll be focusing primarily on those that have made automotive a concentrated part of their business model. So if you don't see many names you're familiar with like NVIDIA, don't worry, we'll cover those later on. So let's get right into it. Texas Instruments probably doesn't need an introduction. They're a giant in the semiconductor space, but especially in the analog and embedded chips. These are essential chips that connect the physical world to the digital one. Think of monitoring tire pressures or monitoring the outside temperature in a car, for example. And when it comes to the EV transition, Texas Instruments is very well positioned. Their chips help in monitoring EV battery temperature, charge levels, and collecting other important measurements. And their chips also help power the electric motor efficiently, collectively known as Motor Control Unit, or MCU for short. And their chips also help in the advanced driver assistance system. Think of radar and parking sensors. They also have a strong manufacturing footprint in the US, which is a major advantage in terms of tariff insulation. Now, it's important to know that Texas Instruments is in the middle of a heavy capex cycle. They've been investing aggressively into new fabs or factories, and they're expecting this to continue up until 2026, at which point they expect their capex to be around 10% of revenue instead of the 20 to 25% it is today. All right, so I think it's worth pausing here for a minute or two before we dive into the next few companies as to better understand the chip requirements for EV vehicles versus a traditional ICE vehicle. Any car essentially relies on a powertrain to propel it forward. The powertrain can be considered the heart of the vehicle, and it's made up of many different components. While both ICE vehicles and EVs have powertrains, they differ fundamentally in their fuel source, energy storage, and how they generate motion. One major difference is that EVs require inverters to convert electric power from DC to AC current. I'm simplifying it a lot here, but the key point is that inverters play a critical role in maximizing battery efficiency. Better efficiency means smaller batteries, lighter vehicles, and ultimately longer range or faster charging times. This is where companies like ON Semiconductor, Infineon Technologies, and STMicroelectronics come in. Traditionally, inverter chips were made using silicon, but today silicon carbide technologies are being increasingly adopted to improve efficiency and performance, especially in high voltage systems. Companies like onsemi, Infineon, and STM are heavily specialized in inverter and power semiconductor technologies, which are critical for electric vehicle powertrains, energy storage systems, and renewable energy applications like solar inverters. And demand for silicon carbide, or SiC chips for short, is expected to grow in EVs at around 12% annually up until 2034. Now, it's hard to predict which of these companies is likely to gain market share in this space, as they're all very well positioned for the next iteration of improvements in inverters as well. One important thing to know is that regardless of the battery chemistry itself, whether it's LFP or NMC or even solid-state batteries, inverters will still have a critical role in the EVs as well. This makes the power semiconductors an attractive picks and shovels way to invest behind the EV disruption. And another way to view the competitive landscape in the automotive semiconductor space is through this heat map. So I've managed to generate this graph with the help of ChatGPT, so I hope nobody gets offended by that, but I think it's very illustrative. As you can see that wherever there is high growth and high margin, there's always going to be high competition. And as Jeff Bezos says, well, your margin is my opportunity. There's a lot of interesting intersections here, but the companies that stand out to me are likely going to be Infineon Technology and Onsemi, just because of their breadth of the coverage that they have across the different chips. So moving on to Tier 1 suppliers, these are companies that are providing major systems and components directly to the automakers. We're talking about chassis, braking systems, infotainment systems, seats, and airbags, to name a few. A lot of these businesses are legacy businesses with legacy growth rates, but some of them have been looking to restructure themselves for the EV era. And to highlight just a few, Magna International, a Canadian-based company, is one of the world's largest Tier 1 suppliers with around $30 billion in revenue. They cover everything from the assemblies and chassis to seating and powertrains, and Magna operates heavily in North America with large-scale US manufacturing. Another company to spotlight is Lear Corporation, which specializes in seating systems and vehicle electric systems, a much slower growth company, but does have a respectable 25% market share in this niche. Another big name in powertrain components is BorgWarner, and what makes it interesting is that in June 2023, it spun off its legacy powertrain components for ICE vehicles under the name Finia, and aligned the BorgWarner name with the more high-growth EV powertrain components and turbochargers. Similarly, Aptiv, a company with a legacy-style portfolio of wiring and vehicle electronics, is taking a page out of BorgWarner's book and spinning off their legacy side of the business while keeping its more high-growth ADAS and autonomous driving technology. And then we have Autoliv, a leader in airbags and seat belts and steering wheels. These are core safety systems that are going to be non-negotiable for any automaker, and therefore could have enough pricing power to mitigate any tariff hits. It also holds significant market share in this space with approximately 50% in each segment. Of course, there are many other companies in the Tier 1 ecosystem, but clearly it's too much to cover in one video, and as such I've grouped them here in this diagram. Feel free to pause at this stage if you'd like, but we'll move on to discussing EV batteries as a new Tier 1 entrant. This area might appear to be at first glance as competitive as other parts of the industry, but there's a clear pattern emerging. Chinese battery makers have taken the industry by storm. CATL and BYD together make up over 50% of the entire automotive battery supply, and ironically will not be impacted by the tariffs at all, since they are not in contract with any automakers in the US. They are also at the forefront of developing the most cutting-edge battery technology as well, with 5-minute charging times unveiled as of late. With the Chinese leading the charge with their LFP battery composition, which is much cheaper to produce than the conventional NMC battery composition, the West is definitely lagging. And BYD has risen to become a giant in the EV space, a completely vertically integrated business with over $100 billion in revenue. It is developing a stranglehold over the Chinese market, with its eyes likely set on further global expansion. We'll cover this more in the second part of this series, looking at automakers and dealerships as part of the automotive supply chain. But that's everything for today, and I really do hope that you found this information useful, and I apologize if any of the information I provided was inaccurate. I am a generalist and I'm not a specialist in this field, but I did try to provide an overview of the entire market so far, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. And please do let me know if you'd like me to continue with part 2 of the series. As well, if you could leave a comment and a like, it really does help me understand better what I could improve in this video making process. And until next time, take care.